Good afternoon. I'm Sharon Squassoni. I direct the Proliferation Prevention Program here at CSIS, and I'm delighted to welcome you into this nice, cool enclave. I hear that it's really hot outside today. I am very, very pleased to have here with us today Dr. Rajaraman from New Delhi. And before I introduce him, I just wanted to make a few administrative notes. So please take your cell phone and put it on vibrate. We are going to, that's really the only administrative note. The other one is, I think we are totally on the record.
Absolutely.
Right. And this is being webcast. So I think we do take questions via email. Is that true, Bobby? Well, you can always try. You can try my personal email if you want to do that. We are going to have plenty of time for questions, so I urge you to be thinking about that as we go along. Dr. Rajaraman, many of you may know him in some of his different capacities. He's a theoretical physicist by training and studied under Dr. Hans Bethe at Cornell University many, many years ago. But he has taught and conducted research at Princeton University, Delhi University, and the Indian Institute of Science. And has had long-standing affiliations with Harvard, Stanford, MIT, CERN, and Princeton. Some of you here may know him as a founding member and co-chair of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. And when we were talking about, you know, what should he come and present on at CSIS, it's really hard because here's an expert who can talk about anything, really, technical issues, policy issues. And so what we chose to look at was in the last year, since the BJP came back to power in New Delhi, what's happened, what's shifted, if anything, in the worlds of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. So, Dr. Rajaraman, I'll give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And so, again, begin by thanking CSIS and Sharon Squassoni for arranging this talk, and Mr. Bobby Kim for all his courtesy in the logistics. This is my first visit to CSIS, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm overawed by this building. I thought it might be useful to give an update of the past year's developments on nuclear India, particularly because the new government assumed office about a year ago. The philosophy of the party that formed the government, the BJP, has been known to be significantly different from that of the earlier Congress government, which ran the country for 8 years and then several times before that. So there was considerable speculation before this government actually came to power as to how this change might affect the country's nuclear policies, both strategic and civilian. In fact, it may be recalled that the last time the BJP government came to power, within a few months they had exploded the nuclear weapons. So the first nuclear test was done, I mean, apart from the 74 thing, by the BJP government as per its promise soon after it came to power. So the question is, would they do other spectacular things this time or not, and so on. This is a question whose answer you already know, so I'll just elaborate on the answer. There are two topics in particular on which developments or absence of, I mean, much of the story concerns the dog did not bark, as Sherlock Holmes says. You know, things that didn't happen are as important as things that did happen. And they're significant, I'll touch upon them. First is the collection of strategic issues, nuclear posture, such as no first use, and related features of the nuclear doctrine, their relevance to Pakistan's Nasr missile, and to Pakistan's proxy warfare through terrorism, this will be analyzed. The current state of minimum deterrence in India will be analyzed, and I'll also talk a little bit about how well deterrence is working, in fact, between India and Pakistan. Then an entirely different subtopic where also things have happened in the past year. I'll talk about nuclear civilian energy and the cooperation with the US and with France and with Russia on building civilian nuclear reactors. So I'll give a little background of each of these topics and then talk about what happened. In fact, the key thing on the second subtopic is the Nuclear Liability Act in India, which created a lot of problems, and it's on its way to being resolved. We don't know how far it'll get completely resolved. And then during the Q&A session, Sharon assured me we can have a free-for-all, anything. So let me talk about the nuclear posture and doctrine. The last available official statement of India's nuclear security doctrine comes from a note issued by the Cabinet Committee on Security, which is the highest body in India in discussing security matters. It's a subcommittee of the Cabinet. And it released a new note, just in the newspapers, as in the public domain, which is viewed as the official statement of our nuclear doctrine. So this remains as our official statement. I won't describe all that is in it because that's old news. It was based on a draft doctrine that was released in 1999, soon after the test. I think that was a very statesmanlike thing that the government did. Governments generally tend to be secretive, and to issue a doctrine statement within 6 months of such a sensitive matter as a nuclear policy was, I thought, a good thing. It was released to the public, and people like me who have normally no access at all to corridors of anything could read about this in the newspapers and slowly get into to the public debate. So that was done in 1999 and remained as a draft level. 4 years later, it was made official by this release from the Cabinet Committee on Security. And what I'll talk about here is not the full doctrine, which is complicated, but one element of that was a declaration of no first use, and that's relevant to the past year. Everybody knows what that policy is, but India will not use nuclear, be the first to use nuclear weapons against any country. Now, the policy is generally denigrated by many analysts as an empty and pointless thing because it's, after all, a statement of intent, not a statement of capability, and may not be believed by the adversaries. So what's the point of putting it out? In fact, my Pakistani colleagues, whom I meet often from time to time on Track 2 meetings, say that they don't put any faith on this no first use doctrine of India. In the event of a crisis, they would base their strategy on the actual arms movements and deployments and not worry about what the statements earlier to that might be. As hard strategic plan, this of course makes sense. You look at what's going on and not pay much attention to intentions. Nevertheless, I think that it's good that the country put out the no first use statement at that time because it was, first of all, a sincere statement. I believe that the country believes this policy, and it is meant to reassure the world community soon after the tests that our intentions are not nuclear aggression or war winning. So it was a good statement at a diplomatic and political level, whatever be its actual operational usefulness. Nevertheless, throughout this period, there has been a body of opinion within India's strategic community, the somewhat more hardline people, who advocate dumping this no first use policy. They feel it weakens our deterrence, it encourages adventurism on the part of adversaries. They would rather keep all nuclear options open, as, for instance, I believe is the case in the US and is the case in Pakistan. Advocates of this viewpoint might have hoped, and many of them explicitly expressed the hope, that the BJP, which is thought to believe in a much more muscular military and foreign policy, would abandon the no first use clause. And on the other side of the debate, moderate BJP government would be more hawkish and abandon or modify no first use. And so it's interesting that the Prime Minister, even before he became Prime Minister, during the last few weeks of the election campaign, allayed these fears by declaring that he will leave no first use alone, that he will not change it in any way. That happened approximately a year from now. And so the no first use remains as stated in the old doctrine documents. And one would call this is a non-development. That's what I meant by the. So that nothing has changed, but it's an important non-development because this is one that was worrying a lot of people, and even now people would like to see it changed. So this is one thing that's happened. The other thing was there were some other changes in the cabinet committee's 2003 doctrine, which were not there in the earlier doctrine. Some things were added, and some of them are relevant to today's situation in South Asia. Let me mention one of them is the preconditions for nuclear retaliation. It said that nuclear weapons will only be used in retaliation against a nuclear attack on Indian territory and on Indian forces, a phrase that was added which said anywhere. So this phrase then not there in the old document and added in the new document, and it presumably means then that if the Indians were to go into another country with their forces, and if those are attacked by nuclear weapons, even if that happens in somebody else's soil, India would consider it as an attack on India and can retaliate. So this was added in the 2003 document to explicitly deter a nuclear attack on our forces should they enter alien territory. It's not very implausible that in today's situation, because after Pakistan developed the Nasr, which is a nuclear-capable battlefield missile, which could be used on invading Indian forces. So this possibility that Indians may be attacked in an alien territory by a nuclear weapon is not so, it's not something which is impossible to imagine. But the threat that India will counterattack with a massive nuclear attack, I think is an idle threat. Because if there's only a minor nuclear hit on Indian forces within, let's say, Pakistan, killing a few hundred people, a few hundred is not a small number, but in the scale of things one talks about, amongst weapons of grand mass destruction, it is a small number. Killing a few hundred soldiers and destroying some artillery, India will deem it wiser to retaliate with only a conventional attack. It will be silly to have massive nuclear retaliation, even if the other side drops a small nuclear weapon, as long as it does it on another territory and causes far less than damage, which you would call as mass destruction. So there's an argument for removing this clause. In fact, I used to sometimes write saying remove this clause, because including a threat in your doctrine, knowing fully well that you're not going to go through with it, could lower the credibility. It is, of course, speaks well when you have that in document and then don't go through with it. People would say it could lower the credibility of the doctrine as a whole and reduce subsequent effectiveness of the nuclear deterrent. But of course, the government is not going to do that, because removing a phrase from a document is a very, very active process, and that can be read in 100 different ways. So I don't think the government is going to change that. But in all fairness, the language does not really make it mandatory that we will go and hit them with a nuclear force should they attack us elsewhere, but only that there's the option of doing so. And a distinction between that option and the compulsion is something that the adversary may not wish to take a chance on, so to that extent it may serve some purpose. The second change was the addition, this was, I think, following what the US did, and that is this phrase saying, in the event of a biological or nuclear attack, again, India will retain the option of retaliating with nuclear weapons. I think this was introduced in the US, and then the Indians immediately copied it and introduced it theirs. This, again, is in some sense mostly an idle threat, because biological and chemical attacks can come in all shapes and sizes. Somebody can poison some pond somewhere, a few people will die. That's not in the same scale as calling for a massive retaliation. So once again, like the case of the nuclear strike in other territories, this is again something which probably is not in the mass destruction realm at all, but nevertheless it was included because at that time there was this fear, and largely because it was done by the US. So these are two additional changes that are there, which are still there, which have not been changed by the new government. In fact, the new government really hasn't done anything on the strategic front, which I consider to be a good thing in the sense that so much more could have been done that they didn't do. Now, I'll conclude this discussion of the strategic issues by summarizing, in my view, has nuclear deterrence worked in India's case? First, let me take it versus Pakistan. I think notwithstanding outdated references, which even persist even now, of an India-Pakistan arms race, I really don't think India is racing against Pakistan. I mean, at one time, yes, but no longer. It's true that some Indians get very agitated every time there is news that Pakistan has acquired one thing or the other. A couple of years ago, Cypri made a statement that they have 100 weapons and India has only 90 weapons. Everybody got agitated. That's all. But luckily, these things make very little impact on policy. So I don't think India is competing at the nuclear, in the nuclear arena with Pakistan at all. We already have in place an arsenal which is more than sufficient to inflict unacceptable damage. And the nuclear doctrine says that the purpose of our arsenal is one of a minimal deterrent, which can cause unacceptable damage. It's not a war-winning thing. It's not meant to do more damage than just cause unacceptable damage. We have an arsenal that's more than enough. I won't go into detail because there's not enough time to do this, and therefore no government, even a remotely responsible one in Pakistan, in my view, would consider a nuclear first strike on India. I don't seriously think they would. I'm not worried that they would. In the same way, Pakistan also has an arsenal to deter India. And no serious analyst, in my view, even in Pakistan, expects us to conduct a nuclear strike on them first. They may worry about many other things, but not this thing. So I think there's really, the deterrent to the extent it's there has worked on both sides. Neither country, I think, seriously expects the other to launch a first strike. So mutually deterrent arsenal exists on both sides. But I must go on record saying that Pakistan's arsenal has served a different operational purpose. From the outset, Pakistan has argued that their nuclear forces were designed to also deter a conventional attack by India because it's a bigger country with a bigger army and so on. But the induction of things like the battlefield missile Nasr signals a lowering of that red line, but more than that, the threat of nuclear attacks to cover conventional attacks could apply not just in war, but even in response to an Indian retaliation against terrorist attacks of the kind that's in Mumbai. So if tomorrow there's another terrorist attack and the country, India, were to respond with a conventional hit, would that be considered as something warranting a nuclear response or not? So the issue of developing a nuclear arsenal to deter a conventional attack in the context of terrorism gets complicated. And there are people who in India, many people have the view that the Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, its main purpose now is a cover for subcontinental terrorist strikes. This is the view. It's not a question of my view. It's the view that people feel. So this is a problem. In my view, this is the single biggest problem in South Asia. The only thing that can possibly spark something there is a terrorist attack on India, not necessarily by Pakistan, but by any mischievous element, as they say, who wants to create trouble. All you have to do is to set up a terrorist attack, maybe point some signals towards Pakistan, and you start a whole possibly spiraling sequence of actions. So this is as far as Pakistan is concerned. As far as China is concerned, which is really the country about which much of India's strategy and armory now is being built, our deterrence force against China is far from complete for the lack of delivery systems, not lack of warheads, because the number of warheads is small if you believe in minimal deterrence. So in that context, the developments of the past year, there is the Agni 5, which is a missile, whose range is 5,000 kilometers, was tested again a few months ago, and on a mobile launcher. And if such a thing is placed in the northern border, it certainly can reach Beijing, and it can reach even points higher like Harbin. So finally, India is getting to a stage where there is some kind of a deterrent, but this is very recent. Agni 5, of course, has been under development for some time, but its second or third test has just taken place, and they say in a couple of years it will be inducted into the force. Similarly, the submarine, the nuclear submarine in India, right now it's still a submarine that's learning its ropes, it's undergoing sea trials and so on, and it doesn't have any missiles placed on it, but if the missiles are placed on it, it poses a threat to China in principle. So finally, India is beginning to have some kind of deterrent against China. Until now, in fact, as of today, it has no deterrent at all. And certainly at the beginning of around the time of the 98 tests, We had nothing at all. And I remember after the 98 test going to my first meeting in China, expecting that I'll be surrounded by people asking, so what happened to the test and so on. Nobody gave a damn in China. And when I asked them, aren't you worried? They said, nah, we're not worried. So they really were not interested in the Indian arsenal most of the time. But now I think it's getting to a point where they will take notice. Of course, China has a stock of many more weapons, warheads, and much bigger warheads. But I think if you follow the principle of minimal deterrence, this is something that most strategists, even in India, don't quite understand. Having an arsenal for minimal nuclear deterrence is a very different thing from a war-winning arsenal or for arsenal for any other reason. Because in a minimal deterrence, you just need enough to deter. I mean, as this word goes, 2 bombs dropped on Los Angeles is all it takes. You don't need thousands at all for minimal deterrence. All you have to make sure is that those 2 can get there. In the same way, same argument applies whether it's India versus Pakistan or India versus China. And part of the logic of minimal deterrence is that the size of the adversary's arsenal is not important. If they have 1,000 elephants, you don't have to have 1,000 elephants like in the old days. Here, you just need enough to scare the other guy. So that is a common factor that doesn't depend on the size and the strength of the adversary's arsenal. So in that sense, what we have is enough for Pakistan, what we have is enough for China, what China has is enough for the US, and so forth. So I just wanted to make these comments. Some of these happened during the past year. Some of these are in the way of a background. So now I'll move on to nuclear energy scene. All these are leaving various things open-ended. We can discuss that later, if you like. So let me go to the nuclear deal. Sorry about that. First thing is the old India-US nuclear deal, just for background, let me remind everybody. 10 years ago, India's nuclear energy capacity was appalling. It was only about 4 gigawatts. And some of its reactors were running well below capacity for lack of uranium. We couldn't buy uranium because there were sanctions. Meanwhile, hopes of continuing with the economic growth that was beginning to happen, 8 or 9%, called for a corresponding growth in energy requirements, and therefore, for the nuclear share of that energy production, it was expected that about 20 gigawatts would be needed by 2020 and 50 gigawatts by 2050. And we had only 4 at that time in 60 years of nuclear activity. So it was really, the requirement was really large, and any attempt to reach it was very ambitious. So that's why India went in for the nuclear agreement. There might have been other reasons, which I won't go into, political reasons, but purely from the point of view of nuclear energy, it was ample reason to seek an agreement with the US. And after 3 years of very hard negotiations, went on and on and on, the newspapers covered it, suddenly they had to learn nuclear things, finally led to the lifting of sanctions by the nuclear suppliers group. And I don't know how many of you are Republicans and how many of you are Democrats, but I want to go on record that this was made possible because of the Bush government. They pushed, they did the heavy lifting, they twisted arms into unbelievable shapes so that the deal will go through, and it did. So I think Indians must acknowledge this fact. So in 2008, the deal was complete, and soon thereafter, the sanctions were lifted, and the major benefits that were expected to accrue to us, there were 2 kinds. One is the import of uranium, which we were sorely lacking, both natural uranium and low-enriched uranium for heavy water reactors. And the other, on this front, things are moving well. From that time, from 2008, slowly agreements are being signed with various countries to import uranium coming in. Some sort of a stockpile is being prepared. Australia is the one holdout, but it's expected that Mr. Modi's attempts to charm them might have worked there too, and they might soon agree to give us uranium. And existing reactors are therefore back into action, apart from new reactors which would require the uranium we are getting. The other benefit that was supposed to accrue, that's the bigger one, more difficult one, was collaboration on building foreign reactors in India. It was clear that the capacity of the Indian reactor building community was just not big enough to handle the kind of growth that was needed. So it was important, the growth depended very strongly on requesting other countries to build reactors in return for money. In this, again, there was a very rapid movement in the first instance. Soon after the deal, reactor suppliers from US, Russia, and France were waiting in the wings for the NSG to lift. sanctions to lift, and there seemed to be enough demand for all three. There was no fight between any of them. We wanted them, the French, we wanted the Americans, we wanted the Russians, all of them to build as many reactors as they wanted. So initial agreements and MOUs were signed with the following three. Westinghouse and GE to build their ABWR AP1000 reactors. Rosatom from Russia to build 8 more of their 1,000 megawatt VVER reactors of the kind they are building in South India now. And Areva from France to build 6 of their advanced EPR reactors of 1650 megawatts in Maharashtra. So these agreements, initial agreements and statements of good intent were signed very soon after the deal was done. Things looked very positive at that stage. And then came the Nuclear Liability Act. So I'll say something about the Nuclear Liability Act. With so much nuclear expansion planned, involving various parties from various countries and so on, it was clear that a good, tight nuclear liability law was needed, especially for nuclear accidents. So the Indian Parliament passed what's called the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Bill in 2010. The bill had several progressive measures, including a total operator liability of $450 million. They are measured in SDRs for some reason, but it's $450 million. But the important thing about the bill was that this money was to be dispersed within 3 months of the accident to the victims, who don't have to make legal suits and so forth. They just have to show the damage has been done. So it is a very progressive act compared to something else that had happened in India, which is what's the next item. The bill, the Nuclear Civil Liability Bill, was discussed in the Parliament by some coincidence on the 25th anniversary of the Bhopal gas leak tragedy. Most of you may know what that was. A poisonous gas of a Union Carbide plant got released, and tens of thousands of people died. And even today, many of them have not recovered. The children are getting problems. So it was a huge tragedy in India. And the public sentiment was that Dow Chemicals, which owned it at that time, did not adequately compensate the victims. So the Parliament, in that kind of mood, in the shadow of the 25th anniversary of Bhopal, passed a very strict, comparatively strict nuclear law, which demanded that the operator, which of course the operator in India means the Indian government. We run all our reactors. So the government was required by the law to pay compensation to the victims, but having done that, they would have right of recourse from the supplier if fault could be shown. There is a proper language for it. I have the entire text somewhere. I'll show you. Now, such supplier liability normally makes sense in terms of common sense. You buy a car, depending on whose fault it is, you can certainly sue Toyota or whoever. Okay? So it's more the norm than the exception in commercial purchases. And in fact, in the 3 Mile Island, people sued not only the reactor operator, but the designers and the constructors. The operator sued the designers. So all this happened even within the US in terms of nuclear liability. However, in the international reactor purchases, supplier liability goes against current practice. There's the most recent of these, the Convention on Supplementary Compensation, where the operator will be fully liable for damages. So the Indian law, by adding on supplier liability, was doing something unconventional, and not unexpectedly, all the suppliers from all the 3 countries, US, France, and Russia, were unhappy with India's supplier liability clause. It was also not clear, even if they accepted it, who would insure against this. So the Price Anderson doesn't exist in India, so it's a different world, and it was not clear which insurance company would give even a policy to cover nuclear liability, whose damages were sort of unknown, and people had all kinds of images of how much it might cost. So as a result of that, as soon as the liability law came in and people understood it to be what it was, progress came to a complete halt in terms of nuclear reactor purchases from any of these 3 countries. The government worked hard to find a solution acceptable to foreign suppliers, including a set of rules. It turns out in governments there are all kinds of ways of finagling around things. So there is a law, but then there is a law has to be interpreted. Then to execute the law, you have a set of rules. So therein you can slip in a few things. And therefore the guidelines for the operation of the liability bill, the government formed a set of guidelines where the quantum of penalty was sort of mitigated without violating the law. But foreign builders still remain unpersuaded. So this went on for 3 years. All this was in the previous government, the Manmohan Singh government, which had invested so much in the nuclear deal. People will recall the government almost fell and had to resurrect itself because of the nuclear deal. So there was a lot they had invested, so they continued to try hard to make sure the reactor building part of the deal also fructifies. Finally, a year ago, there was a breakthrough with the Russians, essentially March or something. The plan was, the breakthrough came because of the following plan, that the Indian insurance company, General Insurance Company, which is a public sector, offered to evaluate each component of the Russian reactors and prescribe an insurance premium. It agreed to insure them. It prescribed a premium that will charge to cover compensation that Russia has to pay after an accident. And the government was also willing to pay the Russians a little bit more money for purchase of the reactors to take into account the premium that will be needed to pay this insurance. And as I say, I should mention that all this has nothing to do with the BJP or Mr. Modi. This was all done the month before he came to power. And the last few days of the earlier Congress government, their years of effort towards making this happen bore some fruit just around March, April of last year. So the Russians got off the block, and they were already, in any case, building 2,000 megawatt reactors in a place called Kudankulam in South India, which had lots of protests, and the protests, in fact, attracted attention all over. And they were building this even before the international sanctions were lifted in 2008. That's by using what is known in the trade as grandfather clauses, okay? Claiming that the agreement to build the reactors in India was made before the sanctions were laid down. This is a highly debatable thing. Where was that agreement made? Did two guys just whisper it to each other on the stairwell? Was it written down? But the international community, so in one of these reactors is functioning, the other is expected to commission. The international community just looked the other way on this grandfathering story. They let it happen. These are the mysteries of the international community I don't understand. In fact, the Chinese are doing the same thing. They are selling reactors near Karachi to Pakistan, using again the grandfathering argument that the deal was struck between them long before the sanctions came in. So some reactors were already being built, including 2 by the Russians in India. In the new deal, after the sanctions were lifted, 2 more Russian reactors were negotiated to be built, $2.5 billion each. And the bottom line is that the price of the reactors would be such that it will cost customers 6 rupees a unit, which is roughly 10 cents a unit, which is kilowatt hour. Okay. And this price that the Russians would be given for their reactor took into account the liability costs. So the premium was included, so the Russians were happy with the price, and this has been now negotiated and sealed. On US reactors, there was progress only after Mr. Modi. Before that, there was no progress at all. And as you people know, Mr. Modi went on a blitzkrieg of foreign visits after the new government came to power, and he was very well received in all of them, and partly because of his impressive electoral mandate, partly because he had this image of a man who can get things done, and equally importantly, an influential Indian diaspora, particularly in the US. And in these visits, Mr. Modi always had the Indian nuclear program, I mean the civilian nuclear program, as one of the items for discussion. So when he visited the US last fall and had this great event at Madison Square Garden, and also got a friendly reception from the President Obama, and then Mr. Obama subsequently agreed to come as the chief guest at our Republic Day celebrations. So a lot of bonhomie happened in last summer, fall. As part of all this, the 2 leaders agreed to actively solve this US reactor liability problem. They applied pressure on their people, with Indian and American representatives to urgently find solutions before Mr. Obama lands in India for the Republic Day. And solutions were found. I mean, both leaders of 2 governments pressed on it, solutions are found. And the solution had the following highlights. Oops. One was the insurance pool. Once again, like with the Russians, the liability for the American reactors would be covered by Indian insurers. Half of it would be covered by Indian insurers, and the other half would be covered by the government of India. So some people are upset in India that, look, you're covering their damage liability, but that was what was negotiated, and Mr. Modi has so far been able to withstand whatever pressure there might be against this. The other important part of that agreement with the United States was that the US had earlier wanted, as per their own law, periodic inspections of their reactors for non-proliferation purposes. The Indians didn't like that, and the US withdrew that demand on the grounds that IAEA is in any case going to be safeguarding these reactors. So they on their side, they pulled back that demand. The other concern was that in the liability law, there is a clause which says, like lawyers like this phrase, notwithstanding all the above. So notwithstanding all the above, anybody can sue anybody else in the country in the law of torts. And that this Liability Act does not exempt the suppliers from normal civil suits allowed by the Constitution of India. So that translated means that anybody in the streets can say, look, the environment has been ruined by this nuclear reactor explosion. Doesn't matter what the operators paid the victims. The country is, has all this expenditure to spend. So there may be a lawsuit with no upper limit at all. So this was a matter of concern for the US. It is one particular section of the Liability Act. And the government of India officials seem to have successfully convinced the United States government officials that such law of tort will be used only against, can be used only against the operator who was directly involved and not the supplier. How you convince these things, I don't know the details. The Attorney General of India is supposed to prepare a paper, passed it on to the legal experts on the American side. At the time when Mr. Obama left, both parties seemed happy. This is all I can say. I haven't seen that document, nor could I really have interpreted it. It really requires a much more expert legal qualification than I have. But one must caution that the American reactor problem has not been solved. First of all, unlike the Russian reactors, the American reactors are going to be built by private companies. They have stockholders, they have a bottom line, they have profits. So even if the two governments are satisfied with the agreement, doesn't mean that the builder is satisfied with the agreement. And as far as I know, as of now, both Westinghouse and GE are looking at the fine print. And somebody told me this afternoon, oh yeah, they'll keep looking for another 2-3 years. So it seems it's not clear how much, how problematic that fine print is. So as of now, that hasn't been crossed, even though the two governments have agreed. And there will be a certain amount of political pressure, I'm sure, to make sure this works out. But and there's an additional complication. Because Toshiba and Hitachi have links with Westinghouse and GE, if I have links, I'm putting it in a diplomatic way, we in India will also need possibly a nuclear cooperation agreement with Japan to buy the American reactors, because Japan's components are there, Japan's ownership, stock ownership is there. So one may need an India-Japan nuclear deal, which we have been seeking, we haven't gotten yet. So there are all these problems still pending with respect to the fruition of the Indo-US cooperation on reactor buying. Okay. And finally, I conclude with some remarks about the French reactors. Again, in the last days of the Congress government, the poor thing made a strong push, and France and India agreed to a price on the EPR reactors, where they managed to lower the price from what the Areva people wanted at the beginning, which is 15 cents per unit, down to 6 cents per unit. This was agreed. And France has also decided to provide India with a loan for the project of building those reactors. All that is all good, but can Areva deliver on the agreement of 10 cents a unit? Their contract to build a similar plant in the UK is running into various problems, but even if it all works out successfully, there the cost is 15 cents. And there is no supplier liability in UK. It's only in India. So it's not clear how the French can deliver on this. So once again, Mr. Modi came to the rescue. He went to France, and there was much bonhomie, and an agreement was signed as a result between Areva and an Indian manufacturer of reactor components called Larsen & Toubro. And the deal was that Larsen & Toubro would make reactor components for the French reactor. This satisfied many requirements. One is that the government wanted to push local manufacture of things. And secondly, if this company has been producing components anyway in India for Indian reactors, so it's not that they have no back experience in this. And if they do, in fact, produce critical components for the French reactor, it will first of all reduce costs. Costs are much less in India. And secondly, avoid the problem of Areva sourcing again some components from the Japanese. So these two advantages would accrue if this plan works through. In fact, Areva is constructing 2 EPRs in China at Tishan, and at 4 billion each, and those seem to be progressing okay. And the costs there are also lowered because Chinese collaboration has been allowed. So the Chinese are into the technological scene, and that brings the prices down. So maybe a similar deal can work in India, but Areva is having very serious problems, as people know. Already 4 or 5 months ago, one read in the New York Times what happened to them. Their reactors, particularly their construction of EPR reactors, they build all kinds of reactors, but their EPR reactors, the state-of-the-art reactors which they want to build in India, they're building one in Finland. They've been building and building and building for years now. There has been a huge delay. It was supposed to be ready 2005. It is now 2015, and it's not ready. The costs have gone up from 3 billion euros to 8 billion euros. It's still not done. We're still counting. You could say this is because the Finnish are finicky, as they say. That's not the point, because in France, in Flamanville, there's another reactor, same size, same capacity, which the French Areva is building for France, where again, there has been a delay. It's still not complete. And the price has again gone up from about 3 billion euros to almost 8 billion euros. Some problems are therefore arising in building this extremely sophisticated reactor. It's not coming within the projected costs. And it's also not clear whether Areva as a company will recover from its financial problems. The latest news I heard was that it's now been given a Standard & Poor rating of BB minus. It was BB plus already. BB plus meant really don't lend them anything, and BB minus is a couple of steps lower. So the company is having problems. The French government is worried about it. They're taking steps. People will be fired. All those things will happen. But at the end of it all, will Areva be in a position to construct reactors in India is not clear yet. So on the French reactor too, one has to keep one's fingers crossed as to what will happen. Thank you.
I'm just going to shut this other microphone off. That's fine.
Sorry.
That's fine. Thank you. That's a full plate of issues.
But done within half an hour, I think.
But you did it within a half hour, so that's terrific. Well, I, for one, have a whole list of questions, but while you guys are, you in the audience, gathering your questions, I may take the chair's prerogative to ask one or two. Right now, even as we speak, the NPT review conference is going on up in New York. And as you know, one of the quid pro quos for the U.S.-India deal, for the U.S. unlocking the door to the nuclear suppliers group, was to bring India kind of into the fold, sort of to accept norms of non-proliferation. And so one of the positive developments, I think, up at the NPT is, and through the PrepCom process, has been the 5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT have put together reports. It's hard to describe. The basic point was to be a little more transparent about weapons issues, fissile material production, that sort of thing, and do a standard report. So, do you think, here's my question, it's a long wind-up for a simple question. Do you think that this is even though obviously India is not going to join the NPT and has certain problems with the NPT, but that kind of reporting is ultimately very important for transparency and accountability, and if we believe eventually we'd like a world without nuclear weapons. So is this perhaps in the cards? Is this even discussed in India?
Well, I'm not of the government. I'm not indulging in any act of treachery in mentioning these things. Frankly, you know, a year ago, or a few years ago, emanating out of this town was the NTI index on, various nuclear security and so forth. And India did pretty badly in that. I think it was second last or third last or something like that. And this year it ended up being the worst, I think. And there was considerable unhappiness back home about that issue. And while that index was being prepared, the government of India was asked several times by NTI to answer the issues that were raised. And the government politely said, no, we don't want to engage in this at all. So this is a typical example. As a result of that, got a bad index in 2012, got a bad index, rating in 2014. Gradually, the government is realizing the importance of being transparent. Their earlier view was, look, this is between diplomats. We tell the Pakistanis, we tell the Americans through proper channels what's going on. We don't have to tell you. You're just an NGO. This has been the operating philosophy of the government. So what they actually do in the way of safety and security is a lot better than what appears from outside. And the fact that the world is changing and that you cannot any longer continue with daddy knows best as a philosophy is something which is not caught on yet fully. It's happening slowly. The government has, in fact, put out a little pamphlet last year, 2 years ago, on India's nuclear security and safety, the steps that they have taken. I really think this is because of the pressure that came from these indexes. So it is happening, but it's happening slowly, and it's certainly true that we have not believed in transparency. It was felt that these are all sensitive matters, and as long as we assure other governments, there's no reason for the public to get into it, which is no longer consistent with the world as it is today. So I think it's happening, but happening slowly. It has not fully happened. But it's in the right direction, more and more.
Do you think that the BJP also...
Well, the BJP is unlikely to be more transparent than the earlier government. But I think the lack of transparency is not so much a political thing as it's a bureaucratic thing. It's the departments and the officials in these places who are not accustomed to talking about things openly. I don't think the government has told, the political leadership has told the ministry, the foreign ministry or the nuclear people not to make things transparent. These are considered to be technical matters. If the nuclear people thought something could be put in the open, the government wouldn't mind. So I think the change of leadership here wouldn't matter unless top political leaders come and tell Mr. Modi, your country is not being transparent. That would make an impression on him purely in the sense of relations between top political leaders and countries. That may set something going below. But a priori, they don't have a view on this, I wouldn't think, one way or the other.
Thank you. I'm going to open the floor. So we have a microphone in the back. We're going to go to Paul Walker first, and then second and third. So please just state your affiliation, and Emily this way. And then try to make it a question.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Sharon, and thanks for the nice presentation. I want to ask you a very basic question about what's driving, what in your mind is driving India's desire for nuclear power. Those of us who I think know a little bit about India realize that it has enormous socioeconomic needs, and given the last decade or more of escalating costs, which you referred to, with regard to the Olkiluoto reactor in Finland and now the Flamanville reactor in France, and given the Japanese recent experience as well, it would seem to me that this is in some ways a very foolish, uneconomic choice that India is making. Probably any country, let alone one with so much economic needs as India today. So why would India be doing this? Why aren't they more emphasizing either gas, energy, or solar or wind or other sustainable energy sources rather than nuclear?
Well, I think several streams in what you've said which merit being answered. One is that there is, in fact, a huge amount of emphasis now on solar energy in India. These things are not really competing with each other because the government is finding funds for what it's worth. When during Obama's visit, there's a $20 billion deal on solar energy. Some kind of a promise, of course, at the level of framework agreement. But so there is a great deal of emphasis. The wind capacity in India has always been much more than the nuclear capacity. It's just that the wind installations work only 1/7 or 1/6 of the time, wind being what it is. And so the production is less, but the capacity is much, much more. So in a sense, the nuclear has received much more public attention. But the fact is that a fair amount of emphasis, maybe not as much as should be, has gone into solar and wind already much in the, amongst the important things in the new government's policy that one reads it every other day. But what about the nuclear side? Well, the nuclear side has been going on since 1947. It's an old thing, and slowly it's grown. And the sanctions were lifted, so naturally it seemed like a good opportunity to grow in that direction. And I used to be a supporter soon after of the whole India-US deal for that reason. And I thought the nuclear energy should be encouraged in India in 2008. Prices were not so bad in 2008. The US had just started the renaissance. And in fact, contracts were received from 20 different companies. None of them are making it now because of costs. So the cost is a relatively new development, given the time scale in which these decisions are made. And I'm sure the costs will eventually become a dampener in the Indian project. There's always a turnaround time in this. I don't think we need to abandon it, but certainly need to focus more on other forms of energy. The government's slowly doing it, in my view. Certainly the French deal, I think, is gone, and the US deal doesn't seem to be working. For whatever legal reasons, we may be surprised that it works someday. So on its own, costs as well as these problems may lead to a slowing down of the nuclear program. The other part of the nuclear program, which was very highly favored by our agency, was the closed fuel cycle business. It was thought that we don't have enough uranium in the country, and Mr. Bhabha, who's the father of our nuclear activities, said, look, you got thorium, and it's possible to convert thorium into U-233, et cetera, et cetera. So there has been a plan since those days of having fast breeder reactors which would convert thorium into U-233, which would then peel off and reuse and so on. That's the closed fuel cycle. It's a religion in India. Everybody believes in it. But once again, those breeder reactors are not progressing as fast as one thought. So, and also uranium is available in plenty after the deal. So there is an argument for slowly phasing it out. But once an agency has been working for 25 years on a project and slowly overcoming difficulties, you can't tell them to stop. So these are political realities. But in terms of the spirit of what you're saying, I agree. And I think it is going to happen regardless of what anybody thinks. The costs are going to bring the nuclear down is my thing. So even though I was a supporter once, I'm no longer a supporter of nuclear energy because of the costs. I'm not that worried about the hazards. I think they have been exaggerated. It's my view. But the costs will bring it down, in my view.
Question over here.
I'm Saira. I'm visiting fellow at Stimson Center. Thank you very much, Professor Rajaraman, for such a wonderful talk. Like you mentioned that India is pursuing minimum deterrence. In October 2014, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, he stated that India is going to shift its posture from credible minimum deterrence to only credible deterrence. So do you think that India is going to increase its nuclear weapons with a high rate, or India is going to pursue open-ended? And my second question is about this tracking system. You mentioned that India did not agree to this tracking system despite of the fact that US insisted on it. Do you think that this is going to have some implications for India's nuclear program, given the fact that India's separation of civilian and nuclear facilities are not physically separated and not, nuclear experts are not separated on that? Do you think does it has any implications for India's nuclear program? Thank you.
Well, if the country drops the word minimal from the Twitter, I think it will be a very bad thing, is my view. And I don't think there's any serious proposal. In some context, you might have said that. There are many people who believe in that, but that goes against the whole spirit of the nuclear doctrine. There are, of course, lots of people who feel it shouldn't be there. For me, I'm against nuclear weapons. So for me, that word minimal is the one word I hang on to and keep on hitting them with the word minimal. So I personally think it would be bad. I don't think there's any serious move to do that. You might have mentioned it somewhere to a collection of people who probably wanted to hear that. So I don't see any other evidence other than that statement that will happen. It won't happen easily. There will be a lot of resistance to that. On the separation of facilities, it is already going on. It is, for instance, certain places like Kaiga and Kalpakam are facilities which are now fully military. So even though power comes out of it, that power goes into the breeder. It's one of the 8 protected. So I think the separation is going on. The separation of the human beings hasn't taken place in some sense. Same person is the chief of both. That happens in many places. But the process of separation of the physical facilities is happening so that inspections and safeguarding and so on can be done conveniently at one place without intruding into a place where it shouldn't go. That process is beginning to more or less happen now. What has happened is a cluster of reactors in certain places have been called military and clusters have been called civilian, and they are not in the same region at all. So.
We have a question up here, Mike.
Michael Lowenthal with the National Academy of Sciences. You've talked about the nuclear doctrine, and I wondered if you could say anything about how any change in the nuclear doctrine might be translated into actions or changes within the nuclear weapons enterprise itself, the production and so forth. There have been changes in the new developments in enrichment and things like that in India that have people asking questions, and it's not clear how it links up to the doctrine.
Well, the doctrine, the important thing is, of course, whether it's minimal and so on. If it is minimal, then there is also a question of how much you think is needed for minimal. That remains as an item of debate. As of now, the reactors that have been designated to produce weapon-grade plutonium are continuing to do so, but there isn't too much of it. There's only one reactor left. There's the Dhruva. So any change in policy right now is not going to make much of a difference. The real difference will come when the breeder reactor is completed and you see what happens to the plutonium that is siphoned off that. That is real yummy weapon plutonium, which comes out of a breeder reactor. So whether the claim... Yeah.
Can we quote you on that?
No,
Real
oh,
yummy?
sure. Yeah,
Is that a technical?
Yeah. Well, it's not technical term. As from tomorrow, it may become one. But yeah, because it's essentially a dry cleaning instrument, the breeder reactor. You feed in bad plutonium, you get out weapon-grade plutonium out of it. But the government claims that they're using this plutonium only for feeding further breeders to generate more power. So at the time when the breeders have worked for 5 years and the rods have been taken out, reprocessed, what it does with that material will determine whether there's going to be any significant increase in the weapon count or not. Until then, the Dhruva is going to go on. Dhruva can make at most 3-4 weapon warheads a year worth of material. So that's not a very rapid growth at this time. So at the moment, I think any changes of policy is not going to significantly affect the warhead production. It might affect the delivery system production. Those things may happen. So the launching of the submarine, the launching of the Agni 5, they are examples not of any change in doctrine, because the doctrine always said there would be a triad of sources from which these can be sent up. So there is no change of doctrine, but there is progress in implementing those aspects of the doctrine, which may very well be pursued quite vigorously by the current government with its ideology being what it is. I don't know if I answered any.
So we have a question back here, Jeff Smith. Sorry. No, I'm sorry. You can then no. Jeff first, and then Jeff had his hand up first. No.
Oh.
Sorry.
Sorry. Who do you want to go?
I'm sorry. The gentleman behind you first, and you can follow up. Just pass the microphone. We'll take two at a time.
It's Jeff Smith at the Center for Public Integrity. Could you say something more about the expansion of enrichment capacity at Mysore and Chalakere, the two new facilities that are under construction or have been? Mysore has been operating for a bit, and it's still being constructed. Mr. Lowenthal's question asked you about the impact of enhanced capacity on perhaps your weapons development and the strategy that underlies the potential use of those weapons. And you answered about plutonium, but the expansion that's underway now has to do with enrichment. And as you know, many outside observers feel that the expansion exceeds what's necessary to fuel the reactors on the submarines. So they see an excess there, and they're wondering what that excess is for. I'm interested in your opinion about what it's for.
Let me answer, shall I? Yeah. Well, it's true that more expansion, there is expansion going on in enrichment facilities. The government statement is that we are going to build a whole fleet of these submarines. The second one is already, the hull has been done, and the third one is already beginning. So it's hard to say with any surety that these are not going to be used for that, the new enrichment facilities. I don't know what is the quantitative basis of worrying about that yet. I'm sure people have said so. I personally would think that there is no plan to build weapons using HEU. One reason might be if the government wanted to have H-bombs, fusion bombs, for which you do need HEU in various intermediary capacities. But I don't think the government has any plans to revive building stronger weapons than the good old 20 kiloton, 50 kiloton fissile weapons, fission weapons we have. Once again, this is connected to minimum deterrence. Certainly, you want to make a bigger bang for the buck, you would want to build the H-bomb, and there was also the feeling that the earlier one fizzled out. There was much talk about that. But the government hasn't picked up that fizzle and saying, well, we must therefore go back and test again. That's a related issue. If that fizzled out, then if you want to build bombs using HEU and so on, you'll have to test again. Computer tests may not be good enough. And testing is something I'm quite sure the Indians don't want to do. Not only will you lose the NSG and all the benefits that come from it, you'll simply bring a lot of opprobrium on yourself. So even though people don't accept this minimal deterrence, regardless of what's written on paper, by and large, there's no great demand to increase the arsenal a whole lot. Even if people worry that Pakistan has got some more weapons, that just dies out after a few days. Some of us get on TV, and that's all that happens. So I really don't think there's any. This is my reading, of course. Much of this one has to go by one's nose. One doesn't really know what's deep inside in the minds of the government. From whatever I know, I don't think there is any real move to enlarge the arsenal a great deal in India. There is a move to enlarge the delivery vehicles, that I know. But the arsenal, the number of warheads, I don't think there is. So if they are building more HEU, my own judgment would be that they are just building it as fast as they can. You never know how much you will need for which submarine, and these are all long-term projects. You don't know when the submarine will be ready. So I think those are probably not meant for weapons, would be my reading, sir.
Right here, and then Walt, you're after that.
Thank you. Ben Lamont with the German Marshall Fund. Sir, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the politics of possibly reforming the Liability Act. Mm-hmm. The nuclear scientific community was notable for its opposition to the agreement in the first place. Are they active at all about the Liability Act? And is there any possibility of a wholesale revision of the act, or are these side deals going to be the future? And if so, can they sort of deliver the capacity that people are hoping for in terms of the number of reactors, et cetera?
Well, as far as the repeal of or any change in the law, I think that's politically simply not possible. The government expended a great deal of its goodwill and its energies in getting the nuclear deal through the NSG clearance. After that, when these liability laws came, there just wasn't enough steam left to overcome the very strong opposition that was there against the suppliers. So I think the chance of the government being able to, and the present government was very much in the opposition and fought for the liability law at that time. So I think the liability law is going to stay. People will just try to find legal ways around it to the extent it is possible. I think that is what is likely to go on. And your other part of the, was that?
Will those side deals be enough to, sort of how much capacity will they be able to deliver? Is that a viable long-term feature?
In terms of reactor capacity? Well, if these three things work, even then I don't think we're going to hit 50 gigawatts by 2050. No way. But we can just add, each of these countries is supposed to build roughly 8,000 megawatts, and that is going to take a long time. So I think even in the next 20 years, if 8 times 3, 24 gigawatts come, that's the maximum one can expect. I think it will be much less than that, I'm afraid. So the notion of having 60 gigawatts, I think is not realistic, and I think the sooner we stop talking about those numbers, the government, the better it would be.
Thank you very much. My name is Walt Slocum. I'm with the Atlantic Council, and I used to be in the Defense Department. Thank you very much for a very interesting, at least for one who was not a specialist, very forthcoming and candid presentation. I wanted to ask a question about the no first use issue. If I understood you correctly, although Pakistan maintains formally a no first use policy, there is concern in India that they in fact go beyond simply the inherent capability which you mentioned, but that they have actually done things which indicate that they regard their nuclear arsenal as a part of conventional deterrence. And my question is, what are the elements beyond the Nasser missile that make one concerned on this point? And for the longer term, is there any prospect of a discussion or an agreement in which both sides would agree to refrain from certain actions that increase the concern about, I guess better to put it another way around, to do things or to refrain from actions that would increase the inherent credibility of the respective no first use pledges?
As far as my understanding is concerned, sir, I believe that Pakistan does not have a no first use policy. It is explicitly said that we don't believe in that because our concerns are different, the things that worry us are different, and in particular because the nuclear forces in Pakistan are developed as a counter to the conventional Indian nuclear forces. So the first part of what you raised, I have to ask you again in the sense, I don't think Pakistan has ever declared a no first use policy. And to the extent that statements have emerged from various people, there's no official doctrine document in Pakistan. Statements always have said, no, we do not believe in no first use. So that is where that remains. On the other fronts, it's hard. At the moment, they do have various kinds of agreements. They notify each other's missile launches. They notify each other's the locations of their reactors so that nothing is bombed there. At that level, fair amount of threat reduction and CMBs are taking place, confidence building measures. But on stronger items, it's not happening. For instance, one of the things in Track 2 and so on I try to push is that in as much as our weapons are demated and de-alerted, in as much as the Chinese weapons are supposed to be demated, and the Pakistani weapons are also demated as of now, why don't the three countries get together and announce that our weapons are demated and that we are in a state of de-alert? Countries are not willing to do that. I even tried to tell the Indians, why don't we just voluntarily just announce unilaterally that our weapons are demated? Countries don't want to make that commitment. There is no compulsion. There is no pressure either from the outside world or from within the domestic polity, which doesn't care about these issues at all, to do that, and governments normally would not do something like that unless there is a push. So there is basically no pressure from anybody else that they should do things to mitigate the dangers. By and large, I would consider both countries to be fairly responsible possessors of nuclear weapons. Unlike the Wall Street Journal article in 2007 and so on, I have complete faith that our boys can keep it as well as anybody else. And there is every reason to believe we had no accidents or anything. But beyond that, any active measure to actually come to agreements and announcements, neither government seems to be willing. That includes China. I've had trilateral meetings with them. They all seem to say, yes, we do it, but we don't want to particularly get into a formal announcement that we do these things.
If I may follow up on that, this question of Pakistani tactical nuclear weapons has been, I mean, I hope it's being followed if there are India-Pakistan Track 2 dialogues now. I have heard that even in other Track 2 dialogues, we've tried to, U.S. and Russian Track 2 experts have tried to point out the, shall we say, deleterious effects of tactical nuclear weapons in the NATO context. When I look at the the security environment right now, I see a lot of troubling things happening in Pakistan. I see it, that being one of them. And then India is perennially focused on China. At what point is there a possibility of de-linking? Because that's a...
De-linking, which in which? Oh, de-linking?
Well, the fact that as India tries to establish its credibility vis-a-vis China, right, Pakistan continually kind of ratchets up a little bit, and this question of, to the detriment of Indian-Pakistani relations, and this question of the language anywhere, I would think almost that's a positive thing, because Pakistanis are seriously thinking about, you know, the use of tactical nuclear weapons on their own soil, yes, against the Indians, and they think the Indians won't retaliate. So that deterrence is, you know, a good thing and a bad thing, right? I would hate to see the two countries walk down that path that the U.S. and Russians did for so many years with,
absolutely,
at such great expense.
And there is also rumors that the Indians are building now weapons which could be sort of battlefield usable. There's no confirmation that they are nuclear capable or not, but cruise missiles are being built, and there's question, can they carry nuclear or not? Many things can be nuclearized later, even if it's not. So this trend is there, and it's a very bad trend. What was I going to say? Sorry, was there something more that you had raised?
So one of the questions is what kinds of confidence building measures, is it dialogue, is it technical measures? I think it's not, probably to me, it's not just statements about demating. It probably has to go a little further than that. So I wondered if you had any suggestions.
One particular new problem has come with the submarines. With the submarines, it's harder to be in a state of de-alert than with other forms of missiles. So any attempt on India's part to talk to Pakistan saying, let's de-alert, after the coming of the submarine, immediately the issue will come up, what about your submarines? That is one thing. The other thing is also the coming up of these mobile launchers. Now that both countries are learning to use launchers that can move around in order to ensure survivability of the weapons, that lowers your ability to do things in the last minute. The launchers have to be more or less have to carry everything with them. You can't keep the weapon somewhere else and bring it over. And so things in terms of technological developments are actually going backwards on this area of de-alerting and keeping things non-ready. Doesn't directly answer your question, but it's a related development. So the technology is pushing it in a different direction, unfortunately. And so when mobile Agni 5, for instance, is out of a cistern, it's a mobile launcher. And once you do that, you have to put the weapon in it. You can't bring it from somewhere else. And so I'm afraid that family of confidence building measures is going backwards rather than forwards.
So if I may, do we have other questions? Yeah. I have one more question for you.
Sorry. Zahid Jamil, Center for Strategy and Policy Analysis. Thank you for the illuminating presentation. It was really helpful. I had two questions. One, you're right that there is no doctrine on no first use as far as Pakistan, but the president had made a statement to the Hindu, in fact, to the Indian press, which has been a matter of controversy. So it's never been sort of reconciled as to what but the president in Pakistan had made a statement. The military may have a different view. We don't know. We'll see. Just to set the record straight on that. One. Second, on the question, I know we're talking about the nuclear aspects, and you said that there would, India doesn't need to have a sort of arms race anymore as far as nuclear is concerned with Pakistan. Can I get your thoughts on the possibility of an anti-ballistic missile sort of race that may take place, and what that would do to the number of warheads or deployment capabilities? Thank you.
Yes, the last thing is a very, very important point. I had forgotten, not included it because of time restrictions. Anti-ballistic missile development will completely ruin all my arguments about minimal deterrence and so on and so forth. because if the minimal deterrence you have is stopped by the other side, you just have to get more weapons. So what would have been a more or less stable ending of the arms race fairly soon can be ruined by successful development of missile defense. Fortunately, I think the missile defense in India is still in its infancy, and it will take a long time before any reasonable defense is possible. Also, these are counter-value weapons, I mean, which is a nice way of saying that the plan is to bomb the people, not the silos, so to speak. And in counter-values, you know, as long as even one city is open, you're vulnerable. And anti-ballistic missile development, even if it goes much faster in India and so on, may at most protect some apex leadership, some central part of New Delhi or something, but it's not going to be can't protect the 200 major cities of India. So I think in some sense it will not seriously affect the Pakistani deterrence capability, even if India successfully builds, which itself is far away. So in that sense, anti-missile missiles, you know, if a country simply has anti-ballistic missiles to protect its apex leadership or its main arsenal or things like that, the other country won't mind as long as the aim of the nuclear weapons is intended to be used on civilian populations and not on. So that being the case, fortunately, the anti-ballistic missiles will not do as much damage as they could otherwise do. But it is still a sort of dangerous development, anti-ballistic missiles.
Other questions up front?
Milton Honig. You know, a few years ago, a while back, there was reports of concern over nuclear exchange over Kashmir. Is there anything current going on in Kashmir that would raise the heat to that level?
I don't think so. I don't think there was ever a situation where inside India and Pakistan, people felt there would be nuclear exchange over Kashmir. Even when the Kargil thing happened, I think I was in the US and that was considered the most dangerous place on earth. I'd call my wife saying, how was it? She said, it's fine, nothing's going on here. So I think that, both countries in this sense have been quite responsible, that the threshold for their going nuclear has been kept very high and they don't lightly consider doing it. Political statements are a different matter. Some vigorous leader may come and say, we'll bomb the hell out of the other country and so on. That's just words. In serious things, I don't think there was ever a situation, even when the two armies were confronting each other nose to nose, no nuclear thing was ever contemplated. So Kashmir is the kind of dispute where unless, I don't think it will lead to nuclear conflict. What is more likely is a Kashmir-like event happening in the heartland of India. That could set things going in the sequence that I said led to conventional thing. A direct nuclear response to anything, any act of terrorism in Kashmir or anywhere else is totally unlikely, in my view. I don't know if that answers your question.
Other questions? Yeah.
Michael Lowenthal again. You described the deterrence strategy in very much the same way that I've seen it described elsewhere, which is sort of multiple bilateral deterrent relationships. Do you or do other people in India think about it in terms of a multilateral dynamic that may be a little unstable in other ways that you wouldn't capture in a multi-bilateral approach?
Multi-bilateral as distinct from just bilateral? I mean,
well,
can you explain the terminology?
So, I mean, what we're most accustomed to in the United States is a bilateral stability relationship with the Soviet Union and then Russia. Clearly, India has two different potential adversaries on its borders that it worries about deeply. It's sort of multiple bilateral cases.
Yeah, it's multiple three-way because there is also links between.
Exactly, and that's what I'm talking about. Is there more sophisticated thinking about the stability of the trilateral relationship?
Yeah, good question, but I think the only stability there would be a set of three bilaterals, so to speak, that each country really feels no need to be aggressive on the other two for whatever reasons on the nuclear front. I don't think the fact of it being, there's no three-body force there. I think it's only pairwise two-body things is my view. That's what's been holding so far. And the dynamics of each pair is going to be independent of, well, except for the Pakistan-China dynamics will affect the India-Pakistan, India-China relationship. But even then, one thing that could happen is that if there is too much concern expressed, let's say by India, about a China-Pakistan nexus, so to speak, as to use that word, it may well be that the Indians may seek an agreement from China saying, look, you can't do this kind of thing. So they may force, there may be an attempt to get an agreement out of all three countries saying, all right, we won't do this, and you don't do that, and you don't do that. That may happen. A road is being built across the Pakistani-occupied Kashmir, and that is the kind of thing, if it turns out that it can land planes on it and so on, people may get sufficiently agitated in India to seek a trilateral solution. The thought never occurred to me until you asked the question, so I'm talking from the top of my head. That is the kind of thing that could start such a process, where one of the three says, the only way this can settle down, only way our bilateral anxieties can be settled is through a trilateral agreement. Then it might happen, but somebody has to feel that way. Pakistan clearly doesn't feel that way, and China doesn't feel that way, that the trilateral is an issue. Indians are the only ones sort of stuck in the fulcrum of that thing. So Indians may someday seek such a thing. In that case, it could.
We have time for one more question up front here.
Thank you. Hi, Yashwant Raj from Hindustan Times. And there's not a question. It was President Zardari who said that Pakistan has a no first use policy. And he said that at one of our summits. We have an annual summit, and he said this in response to a question, which was clearly not a stated position. He was winging it because next morning the army was all over him, and there were denials of all kinds coming out. Not denials, but clarifications came out saying the president was kind of winging it. So just thought I would clarify that bit.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the gentleman there was.
I forget the year which he said this, but he said this to Hindustan Times.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. Thank you for that.
Any final comments?
No.
Well, please.
Other than to thank you.
Well, no. Thank you. Thank Bobby and Emily for your support and our IT staff. And please join me in thanking our guest for a fantastic talk.
Pleasure.
Thank you.